Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining myself, Jade Burke, a journalist at HR Grapevine today, for an HR Grapevine and Cielo webinar entitled Today's Best Kept Secret to Boost Your Talent. Hiring diverse talent has long been a hot topic for organisations as they strive to widen their search criteria to find the very best talent available to them. However, it seems some are not taking advantage of this as much as they can. For example, some candidates are still getting overlooked or even sidelined because of unconscious bias shared by the recruiter or hiring manager during the recruitment process. Not only that, some job seekers are even put off from applying to certain roles, meaning businesses are losing out on that potential top talent. As such, today's webinar will therefore explore how adapting an overall inclusive recruitment strategy can tackle today's ever-increasing talent shortage for in-demand skills, while ensuring these candidates actually stay. I am joined today by Future Focus leader Sally Hunter, EVP for Client Services at Cielo, who works with clients to create ambitious talent acquisition solutions that truly reflect their culture and employer brands, while also creating a measurable link between the talent acquisition strategy and the overall business plan. Throughout the duration of the webinar, we do also encourage you to use the question function to put forward any questions you may have for Sally today. Plus, please do also ensure you take part in the 3 polls that will be held throughout the next hour. So without any further ado, I'd just like to pass over to Sally to discuss this topic further.
Thank you, Jade. Appreciate it. I just wanted to take a moment to introduce myself and also just give a little bit more context to why we think this is so important to talk this through today. So I'm 17 years and counting in human capital management, but also a certified workforce strategist through the Human Capital Institute. And that's really important context for this discussion, because actually, as we talk about diversity and inclusion and recruitment process and how we access talent, a lot of that is linked to workforce planning and how we really address the needs of the future. And just briefly, from a Cielo perspective, we're the world's leading recruitment process outsourcing business. To put that into context in terms of scale of the business, we're working with 176 clients globally, 39 languages across 90 countries. So it's around 160,000 hires per year. So in terms of the customer conversations we're having and the access to data, that's really helped us shape the thinking around some of what we're going to talk about today. So why does diversity matter? And I think we need to, I'd really like to refer you to the small print on this slide. So this is a link to a PwC report from actually a couple of years ago now. But their headline was "Diversity is the solution, not a problem to solve." And what we're recognizing is that there is a lot of interest and appetite to ensure that diversity is really high on the agenda, particularly from a board and shareholder perspective. But sometimes not the recognition that actually it is a solution to a bigger problem in terms of the talent gap and what we all face into in terms of bringing great people into an organisation that will stay and be productive. So I wanted to make sure that I'd shared a couple of data points around why it's not a problem to solve and it's linked to a solution. And that's very much around sustained profitable growth and linking diversity to business outcomes. So all the data is telling us that diverse businesses get better outcomes, that there is a better return from a revenue perspective and more profitable growth in organisations that really embrace diversity and inclusion and ensure that that's part of their DNA. So before we get into the detail, I thought it would be useful to start with a polling question, just in terms of diversity and the degree to which it matters to your organisation. So I'll hand back to Jade for a moment.
Thank you, Sally. Yes, so the first poll is asking, how important do you believe diversity is to your brand/shareholders? Now, the options below, we've got very important, quite important, or not important. So I'll just give you all a couple of minutes there just to place your poll votes there. Okay, fantastic. So the results are showing here that 66% of you believe it is very important, while 29% of you believe it is quite important, and then the remaining 6% said not important. So I'll just hand that back over to you, Sally, now.
Great, thank you. So in terms of what this means from a customer point of view, so I can share some of the data that we see. From our client's perspective, every client has a stated intention to source diverse, high quality talent. And where we're starting to see the pivot is actually we need to make sure that that desire is then translated into high performing employees that are really engaged with the business outcomes of the organisation. So it's making sure that we don't just address this as a sourcing issue, but actually we understand the cultural fit for those individuals and how organisations change to ensure that they're embracing the level of diversity. Inevitably, we would always talk about market forces when we start to discuss this topic, but clearly there is a very significant factor that's impacting us all in 2020. So this slide is something that I've utilised through a number of different conversations related to this topic. And all of these elements from a macro perspective are equally as important as they were before COVID. But it is, I think, essential that we just take a moment to establish that while there has been a huge impact on the level of employment, on the economy, it actually hasn't materially changed the issues that we all face in terms of access to talent and those skill shortages. So when we think about what we're facing into now, the economic forces are clearly a factor. And what I think is useful for us is to then think about that in relation to candidate sentiment. So what we're seeing across our customers is that candidates that are employed are actually more reluctant to move. And so what we need to think about is actually that's still going to impact on our skill shortages, because we are having to work even harder to encourage candidates with the right skill set to consider their next move, given the circumstances that they're facing into. We're also seeing that impact on sentiment is linked to people just making very different decisions about their lives. So what COVID has done is brought everything into very stark focus in terms of health and family and what's really important to individuals. And so we are seeing that there are candidates out there with really high quality skill sets that are choosing to take a step back, spend more time with their family and actually take a break from their particular chosen career. So those skills shortages are still particularly key, and that is linked in large part to technology. So the skill shortages many of us are facing will be in that digital tech space, and that is more in demand than ever, given the virtual world that we're now living in and the degree to which that will live on potentially into 2021, 2022. And so the leveraging of technology has become more and more important, but that also then drives that skill shortage in that digital and tech space. From a legislation perspective, what's been really interesting as you look at the market is that has had to have a certain degree of flexibility in order for us to continue to function as organisations. So when you think about data and data protection, when you think about the legislation linked to establishing whether someone has the right to work, the appropriate checks have been completed, actually there has been some flexibility built into some of those processes in order that we can continue to function in this virtual world. And then the demographics that we would normally look at in terms of understanding how we can access talent and what degree that is going to impact has been hugely impacted by the lack of mobility of talent. So for many organisations, you need to attract the right skill sets cross-border and out of country. And we're seeing those demographics really shift as people return home or are unable to move the work that they need to do. And all of that is wrapped up in this virtual world that we're now in. So to what degree can every organisation pivot to ensure that they have the appropriate platform to have their employees work remotely and potentially for the long term, even to the degree that they might pivot to a more home working environment. we talked a little bit about what this means for the business and the organisation. So when we went through the polling question, I was really specific to ask what you believe is important to the board and your shareholders, because that actually is the language we all need to speak in terms of really embedding inclusion and diversity into an organisation's DNA. And moving it from being a problem to solve to part of the solution is also about the language we use to address that. So you'll see to the right-hand side of this slide that actually it starts to really talk about some of the language that we know is going to resonate in terms of business outcomes. So linking that lack of inclusion and diversity in the overall operating model of the business will ultimately then be connected to things like slow revenue growth, the fact that there is escalating labour-related costs, because to retain good people, inevitably that cost base will start to increase, versus being in a situation where you can be more open to different types of talent coming into the organisation. Equally, that R&D and product development space is hugely important in terms of accessing the right talent to continue to move the business forward and to drive to the new strategic goals. And I specifically say new because what we're seeing across a lot of our customers is that they are pivoting to a different strategy and a different approach coming out of the pandemic, which means the access to those skill sets is going to be so important in order that the products and services that they are pivoting to can be designed and developed at speed. And this all then comes back to thinking about the overall organisation and investor or supplier confidence. So being able to share that new strategy and vision with those investors and have them have real confidence in the organisation and their ability to deliver. And a huge factor will be the degree that you can access talent and the right resource to support that. So what we wanted to do was take a look at tech in particular and the degree to which we can start to think about leveraging a more diverse slate of candidates in order to support the demand for tech talent that we're now seeing in the marketplace. So I wanted to take a moment just to ask another polling question linked to whether that demand has changed coming out of the crisis. So I'll just hand back to Jade for a moment.
Thank you, Sally. Yes, so the second poll today is asking, has your demand for tech/digital skills increased as part of your organisation's recovery through the crisis? Now, the options below, we've got yes, no, this has happened less, or no, it has actually occurred the same. So again, we'll just give you some minute there to place your poll answers there. Right, so the majority, so 54% of you said no, it's actually been the same. 46% of you said yes, and no one said no, it had been less than that. So I'll just pass that back to you, Sally.
Great, thank you. It's always a risky strategy asking this question when we've made some statements around what we see and expect from the marketplace. But I think that's really, that shows the sentiment of organisations out there. So for us to be in a situation where the demand for this type of talent was reducing, given everything that we see from a virtual perspective, would be highly unlikely. But it's interesting to see that we've got probably a 50-50 split between actually the same demand / more demand. And some of that is linked to an organisation's agility and the speed at which they can actually navigate that. So what many of us saw in from a hygiene factor perspective was that tech hiring demand, particularly around IT help desk, went through the roof as we went into lockdown, because actually the demands on our VPNs and just the basic infrastructure of an organisation was really significant. And the amount of queries and tickets those teams were dealing with was going up exponentially. What we're now seeing is that actually, now that the virtual world has settled, we've got the appropriate infrastructure in place, that actually those teams are being asked to do different work. And then this growth in demand is linked to that shift in strategy from a tech perspective. So let's take a minute to look at some of the trends that we're seeing in the tech marketplace and why that has such an impact on the way in which we resource these roles going forward. So one of the interesting things that we talked about earlier was this kind of dilution of some of the legislation to allow us to work virtually, and equally understanding the level of data being transferred across the world as we operate in this way. So coming into the pandemic, there was an issue around unintended consequences. So the pace at which the tech industry is growing and developing means that actually there are elements that simply have not been legislated for, because it's actually the legislation is not keeping up with that change, but equally that there are unintended consequences that result from some of the things that we try to do to pivot and address the marketplace. And that's even more true as we navigate this new normal. And those unintended consequences are things that these teams are going to need to address, but also are going to need to address by other roles in the organisation, like your data protection officer, for example. And obviously the rise of the modern economic infrastructure. So we were all facing into a much more virtual world, but now that we are operating largely from home, that has accelerated that infrastructure, and actually being able to leverage it and work in that environment has become even more important. So not only are we relying on different systems and processes, but it's also asking us to have a different set of skills and capabilities to be able to manage virtual teams. And then this whole data conundrum. So 90% of the world's data was created in the last 2 years. So for the legislation and those people taking those data management and chief data officer roles to keep pace with that is almost impossible. So how do we understand the analytics and the data and support those functional areas within your organization to keep the business safe, and to understand where we're transferring data to and from, and how that's going to impact on the risk appetite for the overall organization. So when we think of that in relation to talent trends, that links back to this interesting scenario we're in, where actually there's high levels of unemployment, but for some of the key roles and skill sets that were in short supply coming into the pandemic, they remain really challenged in terms of that talent availability. And so what we're having to do is understand how we leverage existing employees as well as those that we bring in externally to really face into and support us through our tech journey. And that's never been more true, linked to robotics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and actually the human beings and employees that we need to help us start to continue that journey in terms of supporting what we want to do, our ambition from a tech perspective. Secondly, around the talent trends in this space is understanding the motivations of this group. And coming into the pandemic, we always come back to very similar couple of topics: compensation and work-life balance. What I would add to that, and linked to the candidate sentiment that we're seeing, is that actually tech talent does consider those things to be important, but they have more choice than ever. So being able to accommodate their personal circumstances, to be able to support their need for a purpose and to feel they're making a difference is going to be even more important for this group, and being able to really show them the story of the organisation and what that means for them and the level of flexibility that they'll have coming into a new role. When we talk about that economic infrastructure and it being virtual, we have a huge opportunity in relation to diversity, inclusion and tech talent to really expand our ability to source great talent, because actually this new world that we live in, and shame on us if we don't manage to take advantage of the virtual nature of that COVID has delivered to us, actually it starts to really remove the barriers for attracting talent, because actually where they are is of no consequence. The important thing is you've got the right infrastructure to have them work within your virtual teams. Equally, don't underestimate training and learning and development as one of the levers around managing this talent really effectively. So when we think about the fact that we're inventing new jobs, new demand all the time, we must continue to go back to our existing employees and that landscape to really understand what else can we do in terms of learning and development to allow them to start to broaden their skills, to enable them to step into some of these new tech roles that are coming out. And what does that do in terms of managing your culture? How does that support the way the organisation is seen in terms of the positive sentiment around your employer brand? And lastly, thinking about particularly neurodiversity, to what degree can we address that both internally and also externally in terms of that addressing that talent gap? So this particular group of candidates is so important to the way that businesses move forward and is all part of the solution and linked to actually really high performing organizations. So when you think about this demand for tech talent, but also the unintended consequences, there is a huge advantage to really embracing neurodiversity and that skill set in order to address the bigger challenges that we're going to see as we come through the pandemic. And these individuals, in many cases, have the analytical and pattern recognition skills that we really need to help navigate us through the risks from a data perspective, to understand the analytics, and to be able to drive forward the research and development we need to develop new services and products as we move forward. And lastly in this section, I wanted to talk a little bit about the process of recruitment and really understanding why we need to consider quality versus speed in relation both to where we find ourselves in terms of COVID, but also linked to having a more inclusive approach to the way in which we source talent. So what we're seeing across our client base is that historically there's been the desire for the speed of the process to be the priority has been really, really important. And while it remains important, actually the quality of the hire often is becoming the greater defining factor in your recruitment process. So knowing that someone is the right fit, has the right skill set and will enjoy the work and will stay would mean actually an appropriate compromise around anything from 2 to 10 days in that time to offer process. And when you think about pivoting to make sure that you've got access to more diverse talent, that you adjust your processes to really engage with neurodiverse individuals, for example, that could have an impact on the speed at which you bring people into the organisation. But actually what we're hearing from hiring managers is that they can get very comfortable with that because it has really high quality outcomes for them. So what I wanted to be able to do was to talk about 3 key things that you can take away from this conversation and think about developing and executing within your own organisation. So it's something that's really tangible based on our experience. And the first element of that is to really encourage everybody to use the experience lens to guide thinking. So the experience lens really gives us the ability to understand every change that we plan, but to see it through the eyes of those that are going to experience it, and make sure that when we think about making a change to process, adjusting recruitment models to ensure that we're attracting more diverse talent, that actually that continues to enhance the experience of key groups. And we segment those groups into stakeholders, so those that are typically senior within the HR function, the hiring manager experience, the candidate experience, but also then the team member experience. So thinking about your recruitment and talent acquisition teams and their experience. And while typically we look at this quite holistically, what we're encouraging is that you think about an experience charter linked specifically to diversity and describe in some detail what you expect that experience to look like. So I think a great example here is that hiring manager experience. So when you think about managing change and looking at embedding diversity into everything that you do, actually your hiring managers need to understand things like it might take slightly longer and why that's important and why that's linked to quality. Equally, training and developing those hiring managers to recognise that they may need to take a different approach to the way in which they engage with candidates. So, for example, if you think about interviewing for a neurodiverse candidate, actually You need to really carefully plan an interview. You need to make sure that you're removing ambiguity, that your questions are very clear and specific to allow them to really respond and show you their skills and capabilities. The other thing hiring managers can do is provide that advocacy across their peer group. So as you execute change in an organisation, how do you ensure that actually those that are really embracing it are sharing their experience and their positive experience with their peers? The other piece is understanding how the work gets done. So when we think about, for example, the challenge in the tech space, it may be that actually to engage neurodiverse candidates to be really effective and engaged employees, you need to think about redesigning the work. You need to think about taking pieces of what you need to be done and clarifying that in a way that is really going to bring out the best in someone that needs that level of clarity on expectation and what's required from that role. And then I just want to touch on candidate experience, because I think the hiring manager and the candidate experience are really at the centre of this. This is about making candidates incredibly comfortable with their engagement with you as a potential employer. So that's as basic as really compelling job descriptions and role descriptions that they feel speak to them and actually recognise that they might need to see a structure and a language that really resonates for them. Total flexibility in how they engage. So, for example, again, when you look at neurodiverse candidates, they may prefer to engage via a text solution versus a face-to-face or video conversation in the process. So how do you make it as easy as possible for them to choose the channel that really works for them? And this all comes back to that interview experience. So when you understand and segment your candidates, you can really give them the confidence that they are going to go into an interview experience that brings out the absolute best in them and helps them feel comfortable as they go through that process and how they work with it. So the second takeaway is linked back to that shareholder value that we talked about earlier. So for diversity and inclusion to be part of the DNA of your organisation, it absolutely has to sit at the C-suite and the board level in terms of the commitments that you make. One word of caution here is that that can sometimes manifest itself in very specific targets that are top-down. So what we're advising here is actually build your plan, build your goals, and be ahead of going to the C-suite with what you're recommending. Where we're seeing a top-down approach, it's often an ask around sourcing. So there could be actually we'd like a 50-50 shortlist, male-female, for all of our C-suite -2 roles. Now, while it is achievable to deliver on some of those targets, actually that doesn't solve the broader challenge of shifting the organisation and style and structure to really embrace diverse talent. So what we're saying here is own the conversation, drive the discussion, and take your objectives and goals to the board to give them something to sign up to, versus being a receipt of something that actually could be really challenging to deliver on without the organisation really shifting the way that it changes and develops. So one of the examples that actually we have from a Cielo perspective, particularly around neurodiversity, is that we, as you can imagine, across all those 176 clients and 160,000 hired, we have an enormous amount of data. And actually a big advantage of working with us is being able to access that data as a client and really understand the insight and analytics. And where we've been able to embrace neurodiversity is across reporting and analytics, and understanding that that absolutely lends itself to that type of skill set. But equally, as we build out teams in that area, we need to ensure that we're creating an environment that can really thrive. And so that has always involved a significant amount of homeworking, really structured ways of interacting, and making sure that there's absolute clarity on the expectations of the role and how those individuals interact with the rest of the organisation. So the other piece that we talked about earlier was linked to this internal mobility scenario. and how actually we might need to address some of our talent gaps by looking inwards at our own organisation. So I wanted to just pose a question around internal mobility as we come into the end of this year. Thanks, Jade.
Thank you, Sally. So this next question is, do you intend to increase your levels of internal mobility through Q4 2020 and into 2021? So the options below, we've got yes or no. So again, we'll just give you a couple of seconds there to place your votes. Okay, fantastic. So 77% of you said yes to this question, and then the remaining 23% of you said no. So I'll just hand back to you now, Sally.
Great, thank you. And this absolutely reflects what we're seeing across our client base, that actually all of our customers have a desire to have a reasonably significant level of internal mobility. But as we're facing into shifts in demand and everything coming out of the pandemic, actually this is going to be one of the richest sources of talent in any organisation. And it's being able to understand and address that in a way that allows you to achieve some of your diversity inclusion goals, as well as making sure that you provide the appropriate support to employees as you start to leverage the mobility of that talent across your organisation. So I wanted to walk through a couple of examples of where we're seeing real change happen in relation to both tech-enabled, but also programs of work that really address attracting the right talent that both comes from internally within an organisation and also from the external marketplace. And this is about being really purposeful. So when you think about going to the board and giving them your goals and targets that you feel are achievable, that can often need to manifest itself in specific programs of work that really, and that allows you to work with one area of your business on a program of work that then you can advocate across the organisation, and you've got a story that you can share more broadly. We've partnered with O2 for many years now, and a big focus for them as an organisation was really addressing the talent gap in some of their real pivotal roles, and how do they access some of the latent talent in the organisation and externally. And that manifested itself in a returners programme. And that was about recognising that there are large groups of individuals who have phenomenal skill sets but could well have taken quite a significant career break. And historically, that might have led to them not getting through a shortlisting process, because there's often that question around, well, what's been happening in the last 4 to 5 years? To what degree is their skill set still applicable, given that these individuals have had some time out? And please don't underestimate that this becomes even more important as we come through the pandemic. So what we're seeing is households are being hugely impacted by the effects of that rising unemployment. And what that will mean is quite possibly someone who intended to take a long career break within that household is actually going to start considering going back to work. And how do we tap into some of those skill sets in order to pull them into those roles? So the returner programme we'll dig into a bit more detail, but that's very much linked to bringing individuals back into a specific programme that is also linked to a specific set of vacancies that the organisation has, but recognising that returners often need more support as you bring them into the organisation to get them back up to speed, but also to allow them to really show their skill set to the broader organisation. And just from a tech perspective, there is a number of tech platforms out there, Talvista being one of them, that allows you to consider how you manage the way in which you communicate a role to the marketplace and internally. So it removes those markers that actually allow us to understand that there is somehow a gender linked to the way in which we're describing a role. We found that really useful, just to start to really focus on those job posting and role profiles and make sure that we haven't got, we're not unconsciously sharing a particular language that would make it more attractive to one gender or another. So just digging a little bit more into this returners programme and some of the results that were achieved. So this was linked to being able to really be able to have that balanced shortlist coming into what we were delivering for the CEO -3 roles, but also relating to some of that unconscious bias around individuals who might have had longer term career breaks. So the opportunity to work with O2 across this spectrum to make sure that, one, there was a flexible approach to how people were able to work. So when you think about a returner program, you also need to think about, actually, are we making our organisation somewhere that they feel they can work? So to what degree can we offer part-time? Can we look at job shares? How do we make sure that people can work virtually where it suits them to do so, and how do we enable them to do that in order to support those diversity goals overall? So this programme was actually a 16-week programme, and what that allowed the organisation to do was work with those individuals as returners through a period of time where actually they were a cohort of their own. So this meant that they joined the organisation, they took part in the programme, but that allowed them through that 16-week programme to understand where might be the best fit for them in the organisation, and equally for those hiring managers to engage with that group and really get to know their skill sets. It also allowed for coaching sessions, mentoring and support to make sure that actually that transition back to work was really managed and supported. And we found that all of these individuals had a lot of questions and support that they needed to come actually from the recruitment function in terms of business partnering with them to make sure that we got the right outcomes for them in terms of their roles as they came out of the programme. So what were the results? And actually this programme was hugely successful and almost all the individuals that went into the programme secured full-time permanent roles within the organisation, and that was a combination actually of part-time and full-time. I just wanted to give you an example of the kind of talent that you can tap into when you consider returners more specifically. So one of the individuals had an extremely successful career, had taken a break to have children, so had historically had a role as managing director with Accenture, running really large accounts across the programme. And equally had taken that decision to take some time out and needed a route back. So what this programme allowed this returner to do was, one, to join the 16-week programme and work their way back into the organisation, but equally to secure a role within the digital business. So when you think about digital and tech talent, it's also making sure that actually within your resourcing and attraction program, you're looking at skill sets that are transferable into this space. And using a returners program like this can really give you time to tap into and understand someone's transferable skills that might then lead you to be able to manage that talent gap. Okay. So hopefully a lot of food for thought, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions now or cover off anything in any more detail.
Perfect, thank you, Sally. So yeah, as just mentioned, please do send in some of your questions, as we do still have some time left. But just to kick off, Sally, a question here: to what degree is the pandemic improving the talent gap, given the number of people now out of work? So what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. And this is an interesting point, because what we're seeing is that, yes, there are now a large proportion of individuals who are looking for a new role as a result of the economic issues that we've seen from the pandemic. Unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily solve the very specific skill gaps that we're all addressing for some of these key technical roles. What it actually presents us with is a bigger challenge around how we curate the large number of applications that we'll receive for roles, and really ensuring that we take great care of candidates in that process. Because while they may not be fit for or appropriate for the role that we're looking to hire for, it is actually the case that they could well be connected to someone that is. So the talent gap is not going to be solved by the fact that we have so many people out there looking for work. But what we need to do is have that experience lens in mind and make sure we take care of every applicant through the process, given the high number of applications we're now going to see. And that's also linked to our processes and how tech enabled we are. So it's a long time since we've been in a situation, I'm sure many of us, where we've had a large number of applications to manage. That's really important that we address what our tech platforms can do and how we manage that process, given the excess number of applications we might receive.
Fantastic, thank you, Sally. Another question here is, how do you measure the success of addressing unconscious bias in a large organisation?
So, and this is where we need to consider to what degree technology can really help us, and also understanding that we need to address what our baseline is. So when we look at unconscious bias, there's a couple of things that we can do to ensure that we train and develop our people to be able to manage that. So in order to understand the data, you need to be able to provide the appropriate training. But what we are seeing is that actually the training does land, and actually if you link it to somehow to compensation and bonus, and you make it really important and high on the agenda of the individual, you can get a high proportion of your employees to get involved in learning why it's important and managing that effectively. What we do recommend is thinking about curating your data in such a way that you get a baseline ahead of providing that training. So being able to look at your applicant funnel, look at the decisions that are being made throughout the process before you deploy that training to your employees will give you a sense of where you're seeing that challenge. And it's very important that we all acknowledge that actually capturing diversity data in the application process is quite challenging. It's an opt-in, and in certain countries, it's simply we're not allowed to ask the question. So understand there's always going to be a health warning on the data you have around the applications coming through the process. What you can do is start to really understand the culture and environment of the team, and whether actually there's an element of a hiring manager simply recruiting people either like them or like the rest of their team in style and approach. So being able to capture that data ahead of deploying the training is really important. And then once you've deployed that training and you're supporting the decision making through the process, it's then being able to take the same data and make that comparison and feel comfortable that you're seeing more diverse candidates coming through the process, and actually you're seeing a quantitative shift in that. As to how much of a percentage shift, I think varies depending on the organisation, but you would hope to see at least 15 to 20% shift in decision making that you feel has managed that unconscious bias.
Brilliant, thank you, Sally. One here as well I think will be of interest to most of the listeners today. How can we adjust our recruitment processes to attract more neurodiverse talent?
So, and this is very much linked to addressing, segmenting your attraction strategy, but also it's more linked to the process once someone's had the chance to apply. So we talked a little bit about having the right job description and using the right language that's really going to resonate for someone who's neurodiverse. But the really critical part of this is making it easy for them to apply and making sure that there are options, whether or not that needs to be entirely a technology experience or actually they want to make sure they connect with the organisation to understand in more detail. But the critical thing in all of this is the interview process. So our VP of candidate sourcing shared some data recently that was actually from some insight from a neurodiverse hiring manager. And one of the examples they used was that if you ask someone who is neurodiverse, could you describe how you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? You could get the reply, but I don't like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And I thought it was a great example of That, I think, in a typical recruitment process would be misunderstood and would likely cause you to think that the candidate actually wasn't engaged or was somehow not wanting to respond to the question. What we really see is that actually there was too much ambiguity in what they were being asked, and they were being asked to imagine a situation that actually wasn't working for them or relevant to them in terms of their personal experience. So it's being able to look at your interview and the structure of your interviews and your specifically the questions you're asking to ensure that there is absolute clarity on what is being asked, and you give them comfort that they can then relate back to their personal experience and capability and really show you what they're capable of. So that's the big area that you've got an opportunity to adjust the process.
Great, and I think we've got time for just one more question here. So this question is, how can you keep pace of the data if an internal budget doesn't factor in a chief data officer, for example?
Yeah, really interesting question. So what we're tending to find with a lot of the mid-sized organizations we work with is that actually your data protection office needs to be linked to consultants and flexible resource. So I totally understand why a chief data officer is a huge investment and something that will be potentially leveraged some but not all of the time. So where we're actually seeing a huge opportunity here is to look at your requirements and making sure that actually you've got a suite of contractors or interims or even consultants who are retained on a kind of 5 to 6 days a month basis who can really step in and support you through some of those data challenges. And you will find there are a lot of individuals out there with this skill set who are wanting to work really flexibly because there is so much demand. So being able to have an individual like that there monitoring data issues or incidents as they come in and stepping in when you need them is definitely something that we're seeing our clients leverage. Equally, there is quite a lot of off-the-shelf training and support that can be provided that allows you to educate employees to a certain level to be able to recognise where there might be an issue or where a certain way of operating could contravene that. And I would suggest that that training needs to be refreshed at least annually in order that you've got access to the most up-to-date ways in which the legislation has changed. And then you've also got those flexible consultants supporting as and when you have an actual instance that you need to deal with.
Brilliant, thank you, Sally. So that looks like it's all we've got time for this afternoon. So I'd just like to thank you, of course, for listening and taking part in those polls and the Q&A discussion just now. With special thanks, of course, to Sally for this interesting exploration into talent. Also, please don't forget that we'll be sending a recording of the webinar out for you to listen to later on today. So just like to wish you all to have a great afternoon, and we look forward to welcoming you back to additional webinars in the future. Thank you so much.